Hello, this is Clarence Moye here with Awards Daily and with Michael Engler, director of HBO's The Gilded Age. Michael, welcome.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
It is such an incredible honor and a privilege for me to talk to you because I don't know if you know this, but I'm a huge fan of this show. So
Okay. Yeah.
I'm very excited to dive into it. So I want to start with a couple of generic questions, or more general questions, I should say. Looking at the broad spectrum of stories that Julian Fellows is telling within the Gilded Age, which of those sort of spoke to you most as a director? Which ones did you most connect with?
I think it was this idea that there are different kinds of social strata, social orders. And in America at that time, they were changing so fast. And there was this idea that it was kind of the first time really in history where there was more than just your background, your legacy that would determine what your opportunities and obstacles were in life. And so this idea that meritocracy might take over, a kind of historical social order, and what that is, what is merit? Because is it just the ability to make money? Is it the ability to sort of change things, to make a contribution to society, any number of things. And so I kind of relate to the idea. I mean, it's a funny thing. Our character, Bertha, on one hand, represents the most aspiring, striving in that way. And then there's Marion, who comes in, and I think her point of view is very much kind of the fresh eye that the viewer comes in with, which is like, wait a minute, these are the old rules. Here's this new set of values. What do I actually think? And is some of that old stuff worth preserving, and is some of it worth knocking down? And I think that's always a good question to ask.
So you obviously have a broad history here in television, and this is not the first time that you've worked with Julian Fellows. You'd also directed on Downton Abbey. You directed the 2019 Downton Abbey film. You've also worked with him on another film. So obviously, and there are several differences between the Gilded Age and Downton Abbey. It's not just a period piece. This is separate countries, separate standards, separate theming. But stylistically, how does this differ from something like Downton Abbey?
Well, first of all, this is a much broader scope. And I think it's also, it has more points of view within it. And it really sort of takes in the idea that it's not just how this one family fits into society and the world and the changing world, but it's really how all the different factors in so many different areas of society are all affecting each other and are all pushing for their own voice, their own influence. And so it's the intersection between different parts of society and how they actually cause change and are affected by change is more complex in that way. And how it relates to that particular moment, what was happening in our society and the opportunities that were new that hadn't really existed before.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a society where there's such upheaval, there's such dramatic change happening. It's a very explosive era. But it's also an era of great restraint, of great repression, of great, as in my favorite film, The Age of Innocence, here, right here behind my head. There's so much that goes unsaid when you're directing actors in a piece like this, which is not frequently done. This era is not frequently explored.
Right.
This era of Edith Wharton, for example.
Right.
What is the inherent challenge in directing actors to try to portray that accurate restraint?
Well, I think, it's like everything in a way, where you look at like, what is the subtext going on? What are the real goals and values and objectives of the characters? And then how do they try to get them, given the situation they're in, given the society they're in, the particular place they fit into it, so they can and cannot say certain things in certain situations. And then therefore, how do they express those objectives? How do they go for them essentially? And so, it's in that sense, it's every piece has its own kind of rules about that. A big part of it for us was that there's a very performative aspect to this world and how you behave in society, whether you're an important person, a newcomer, or a servant even. And then behind the scenes, that obviously drops to a certain extent, or to whatever extent it does, given the various people involved. And so a big part of it was kind of showing the difference between how people behave in private and speak and all that, and how they do when they're in a small group, in a family group, in front of servants, and all of that kind of stuff. Because then I think when you see the difference there, you begin to understand that, oh, she's not saying anything, she's holding back in those ways, because you've seen it be expressed more overtly in other situations. And part of it is just the language he gives the actors is so carefully crafted to, work toward objectives within the boundaries of acceptability. So it becomes, I think, a very useful set of limitations to work with, because in some ways it helps give shape to what's going on with people and how they express it or don't express it, or the ways in which they express it.
Yeah. So this is obviously a very complex series where you've got, as you've just mentioned, the subtext, you've got the text, then also you've got these fantastic set pieces of like the lighting of the New York Times building with Edison's light. You've got the ball in the season finale, which you submitted for Emmy consideration, the Gladys is Coming Out ball. You've got all of these things. You've got all of these characters bouncing back and forth in almost kind of a Robert Altman-y way. How do you as a director balance all of that? What are your touchstones to make sure that at the end of the day, it sort of all makes sense and it all comes out in the wash?
Well, those particular ones you mentioned, the lighting of the building, the ball, those are great in a way because everybody on a certain level has one touchstone to have an opinion about, to have a feeling about, and it affects all of the characters, so they can each react to it in whatever way is useful for them. And there's, one of the challenges of his work, and I think it's also one of the things people love so much, is that there's such a tonal range from very comic in kind of bold, even physical ways, to very dry wit, to very, kind of rational discussions, to very passionate and emotional sections. And so I think it's, in some ways, it's more about balancing all of that out, and then everybody just figuring out where they fit in relation to these particular events that are happening, hopefully brings it all together as one thing. But I also think in some ways the strength of it is that it's so many different things that there's a lot of ways in. There's a lot of different ways for people to relate to it, for regular people to sort of imagine where they would fit in that world. So, yeah.
So I'm sorry, I'm obsessed with your shelving back there. Your shelving is fantastic. Period decor. No, you've co-directed the series and you've co-executive produced it with Sally Richardson Whitfield. Talk to me about that collaboration and making sure that you have that seamless connectivity in terms of visuals and connectivity from episode to episode with maintaining your own individual styles.
Well, it began, and I was directing the first 3 episodes, and she was going to do 2 after that, and then we shut down for COVID, and then we realized when we came back with the COVID restrictions, with how far we were, and how much it made sense to really integrate all of our work together and limit it to just the 2 of us. By that time, she was already pretty much kind of worked in as a director into the series in the way that any guest director might be. But we were ready to start up. And so she came on at that point when we started up again as a executive producer and the only other director. There were originally going to be, it was going to be her and another. And so at that point, we knew that we were both going to be doing it all through the season. So we just really worked together, first of all, to catch her up on the decisions we had already made about how we were going to begin the series and the stylistic approach to it and the work with the actors and all of that. And so she was there right at the beginning of when we were actually shooting, but now she knew she was going to be part of the whole thing. So early on, we were both working, we were both shooting and directing and everything. So it was a lot easier than it is in a normal show where you have different directors coming and going over a series. It was much easier because she was there right from the beginning, watching what we were doing, and then very quickly doing scenes of her own that influenced other things that we were doing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So I want to talk about the Emmy episode, the episode that you've submitted for Emmy consideration, which is the episode 109, which is the season finale. It is the episode of the big ball, the coming out ball for Gladys. Finally, we've had it after the entire season. What do you think that episode showcases best about your directorial style here within this series?
Well, I think it's the fact that it can go from very lush and romantic to very comic to very emotional and simple between a few people, and can kind of shape a story that is really big. It includes a lot of people. It has a lot of facets, and the ability to go from telling a lot of little stories and then having them all feel like they're adding up to one big story, so that the pieces relate to the whole in a way that feels like it's building and something bigger than you could do normally on most series, because you just don't have this scale. And yet it doesn't feel like a lot of separate stories. So, it's the balance between the scope and then the detail, both emotionally and visually, I think was the biggest challenge of it. And then for all of that to feel unified in one big dramatic arc.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got Marion's heartbreak, you've got Peggy's heartbreaking revelation and her decision, you've got the ball, you've got the quadrille, you've got all these moments that are juxtaposing against each other of happiness and sadness, as you've mentioned. But the key moment for me is a very, very quick moment. It is when Mrs. Astor comes into the ball, and
Right.
the camera pulls back. There's a wide angle shot from the very corner. It seems like it's like from the ceiling of the universe,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
looking cast down on everyone there. There's a hush over the crowd. There's not much music used. I mean, it's just, and then of course, she moves into a conversation with the Russells. Talk to me about directing that sequence. I know it's a very short sequence, but it is an impactful scene.
Well, that was the thing. At the time, there were such important events, and the fact of Mrs. Astor's arrival meant everything in the world, that it would be spoken about, that it would be written about, that it would change Bertha's position in society. So I wanted to make sure that that moment landed, that everyone in the room took in and expressed what an extraordinary moment it was, and how it's like there's a sudden, subtle but very seismic shift.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a very important thing for me, actually. I'm glad you point that out, because that to me is the turning point of how. So now we know, once it's happened, and then how is it going to go once it's happened? But the fact of it coordinating again, and I think that's a good example where the scope of a shot like that and of a moment like that, where every single person pretty much who's been in the series, other than some servants, are all in that moment, and they each have a point of view about that moment. And so taking the time to just do that, take the moment,
Mm-hmm.
let her walk across, purposely not have it cued, let the silence tell the story. And then the fact that, again, on the surface, they're playing, thank you so much for having me, thank you so much for coming, that they play that in the most understated way, where everything they're feeling is completely buried. But we know what it all means because we've been through these events together, and they're playing it for an audience of essentially the most important people in New York City.
Yeah. Well, as brilliantly as you have directed this episode, there has to be a moment at which, and particularly in this scene, is what I'm thinking about immediately after her entrance, where you've got Carrie Coon, Donna Murphy, Morgan Spector, Nathan Lane. They're coming together. You just have to. I would imagine you just have to step back and just let them do their thing, because they are, all at the very peak of their craft.
That's right. That is true. I mean, that's an incredible gift. Once you set that up and say, here's how we're going to do it, here's how we're going to stage it, here's how we're going to shoot it, there's not that much more to do because of them. And also, even within that, they're all capable of a lot of range and saying, should I try one where he's playing it with a little more of a wink? Or should I try one where he plays it absolutely like nothing unusual is going on here? And so they're all offering up lots of choices and opportunities too. So that's the incredible thing. Sometimes it's really just a question of like choosing exactly which subtle variations I want to put together in which combination.
Sure. And it's the blessing and the gift of having, unfortunately due to COVID, but having this massive assortment of Broadway talent, theater talent, trained talent available for this production. I don't think enough is made about how the Gilded Age gave so many unemployed actors actual income during COVID. I mean,
That's right.
it's significant. I mean, everybody's in there.
It's true. Well, I mean, New York has such an incredible body of acting talent.
Mhm.
It's with such variety, and also because of their stage training, I think they're particularly well suited to this kind of material, in which the language is very much like great theater language. That's the way he writes, and so they know how to play with that and personalize it and not make it feel stiff or removed from humanity, and so that was an incredible thing. And then the fact that we have I always say it's like we have a lot of different acting companies within the company. And so there's the Russell Servants downstairs acting company, and then there's the Russell family acting company, and then there's the Brooks upstairs, and then there's the Brooks downstairs, and then there's George in his office. And so there's all these different areas, the women, the socialite women who gather in different groups. And so what that did, even this season, when people are starting to work in theater again and on other projects, is the opportunity to say, we will need you for these 2 weeks, and then we won't need you for these weeks. And then they would say, oh, I'd like to do these concerts or this other thing for this period. Can we work that in? And if we do, what's the best period for it? So that also gives us a lot of flexibility as well as them. And that, I think, has also made it possible for us to get kind of people who would be hard to tie up otherwise, especially for roles that aren't essentially the primary roles. I mean, to have people like Donna Murphy and Nathan Lane and Kelly O'Hara and a million others, Michael Cerveris, down the line, be able to come in and do kind of these, more supporting roles. They're important, but they're not, the big powerhouses and roles. And so, we're very lucky that they want to come and do that and essentially play for a few days here and there.
It makes it a great deal of fun to watch.
Yeah.
My last question is, I'm not going to ask what I wanted to ask for my last question, because I'm looking at this confrontation, or this, not confrontation, but this dialogue between Bertha Russell and Mrs. Astor in the finale. And I know that is setting up some very interesting scenes coming in season 2, which I'm sure you can't talk about. So I will spare you that, that, but looking back over season 1, I know there's a lot of conversation in modern times about us being in a second Gilded Age. What do you think this season of the Gilded Age and what this show says about modern culture? Are there any parallels in our modern second Gilded Age?
Absolutely, I think there are. And I think, the Gilded Age was sort of the beginning of the red carpet. And I think that whole idea of people using their money, often in good ways, to gain social stature, whether it's by contributing money to a museum and then being there for the big opening, or, to the, contributing $1 million to university or a hospital and getting your name on it, and what that does. And that it's a double-edged sword. The idea that, you know, you can buy your way into prominence, into power, into influence, and it can be a very useful thing for society. In that period, you know, all the great arts institutions and a lot of the social services institutions, none of that existed before that. And so it's a tricky thing because, you know, I think when we look at it still, like, how do we find a way to honor the contributions those people make without giving them permission to act outside the rules of society? And what is the boundary, and what are the balances that are required for that? You know, and we haven't been in a time of such inequality socially, financially, as we are now since the Gilded Age, in terms of, you know, you give these people in return for that a lot of influence, a lot of power, and then at what point it does the balance sheet not even out anymore? Are their taxes too low? Are they getting away with things that other people wouldn't get away with in exchange for that? And, you know, I think those questions are questions that a society has to constantly be reevaluating, because the balance sheets are always shifting. And I think we're in a time that's actually not that dissimilar from them in terms of it coming to a crisis. I think we're coming to a crisis because of all of that. And there's a lot of different ways people are interpreting it. But, you know, that was the beginning of, you know, the labor movement and a lot of social and political changes that were starting to happen, you know, and taxation and sort of corporate structures and everything. And I think that's about to come to a head again for all the same reasons, because the cycle feels like it has come back, you know, completely.
A Gilded Age followed by another era of progressivism, I would assume.
That would be my hope, but I'm only because of who I am, you know, and I hope,
Great.
you know, part of the fun of a show like this is, and it's the same thing with today and the red carpet, part of the fun of it is watching what people can do with incredible money and all of that, and sometimes even taste, you know, that they can do extraordinary things. And it is a beautiful world to watch. But I think it's important to sort of look at it and say, what are the costs for it? And not just simply have it be kind of luxury porn.
Of course, of course. Well, Michael Engler, thank you so much for this conversation. This was very enlightening. I love this series so much, and best of luck to you in the Emmy season. And as you complete season 2 ahead, I hope to talk to you for that one as well.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure.
Take care.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.